The year of our Lord 1872 had bled all the moisture from the Arizona territory, leaving it a cracked and gasping thing. The sun was not a gentle star in the heavens, but a hammer, pounding the land day after day until the very rocks seemed to sweat. This was a place of absolute's blistering light and bone-deep shadow, life that clung to existence with thorns and venom, and death that was as common and patient as the buzzards circling in the infinite. Bleached blue sky. The desert floor was a graveyard of stories. Here, the bleached sculptural bones of a long-dead steer lay half-swallowed by the sand, a testament to a cattle drive that had failed. There, a splintered wagon wheel spoke of a pioneer's broken dream, the wind, the land's only true voice, whispered through the saguaro and cholla cacti, a dry, mournful sound that carried the scent of dust, creosote, and the faint, sweetish odor of decay. It was a smell that settled in the back of a man's throat, a constant reminder that, in this land, survival was an exception, not a rule. Through this unforgiving landscape moved a man who was as much a part of it as the stone and the sand. His name was Kai. To the white men at the forts, he was just another Navajo, a shadow in the distance. But to his people, the Dine, he was a warrior. At 25, his face was already a map of the life he had lived, lines etched around his eyes from squinting into the sun, a hardness in his jaw from clenching it through pain and loss. He was not a large man, but he moved with the dense, coiled power of a rattlesnake, every step silent and deliberate. His shoulders were broad under a simple deerskin vest, and his long, black hair was held back from his face by a strip of leather. He carried a bow of Osage orange that was nearly as tall as he was, and a quiver of arrows fletched with hawk feathers. A hunting knife rested on his hip, its handle worn smooth by his palm. Kai had seen more than his share of fighting. He had tasted the acrid smoke of the cavalry's rifles and felt the ground tremble under the charge of their horses. He had fought the Mexican bandits who raided from the south, their cruelty as hot and senseless as the summer sun. He had learned young that the world was full of men who took what they wanted, their greed a fire that consumed everything in its path. These battles had taught him silence. Words were a luxury, often a weakness. The desert taught a better language, the language of a hawk's cry, the meaning in the curve of a broken branch, the story told by tracks in the sand. Tonight, however, he was not hunting men. He was hunting something more elusive, more sacred. He was hunting the spirit of the Mai, the coyote, the trickster wolf of the desert. The elders said that on nights when the moon was a perfect silver disk, the Mai spirit ran free, and for a warrior to see it was to be blessed with cunning and resilience. It was a private, solitary ritual, a way of reconnecting with the spirits of the land his people had walked for generations, a land that was now being carved up and fenced in by the Bilagana, the white men. The moon rose, enormous and luminous, washing the muted, sun-bleached colors of the desert in a stark palette of silver and black. The shadows of the great saguaros stretched like the arms of ancient, skeletal giants. The air grew cooler, carrying the night scent of blooming datura. It was a time of profound beauty and profound danger. Every rock could hide a scorpion, every patch of darkness a coiled serpent. Kai moved through it all with a calm familiarity, his senses alive, reading the night as easily as a preacher reads his Bible. He had been tracking for hours, following a feeling more than any physical sign, letting the silence of the desert guide him. Then, a new scent reached him, cutting through the clean air. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Wood smoke, and something else beneath it, something coppery and wrong, the scent of spilled life. His body went tense, the hunter's instinct taking over. He slowed his pace, melting into the shadows, his eyes scanning the landscape ahead. The smell grew stronger. He crested a low rise of rock and sand, and the scene below brought him to a dead stop. It was a place of carnage. Two large wagons, their canvas tops ripped and smoldering, lay on their sides like slaughtered beasts. The ground was a chaotic mess of splintered wood, broken crates, and the scattered contents of a life abruptly ended. A rocking chair lay on its back, its rockers pointing uselessly at the indifferent stars. A tin coffee pot had been crushed under a horse's hoof. Pages from a book, likely a Bible from its gilt edges, fluttered in the gentle breeze, their holy words lost to the wilderness. He saw the bodies, dark shapes in the moonlight. Men, women. He did not need to get closer to know they were dead. The stillness of the scene was absolute, an unnatural vacuum where violence had screamed itself into silence. He could read the story in the tracks a dozen or more shod horses, the heavy, rutted lines of the wagon wheels, the frantic, scuffed earth where the attack had happened. Bandits, not Apache, not Navajo. The tracks were of men who rode with iron on their horses' hooves and greed in their hearts. They had come, they had taken, and they had killed. A coldness settled in Kai's gut. It was the familiar sickness he felt at the sight of such waste. The Bilagana brought so much with them wagons, strange tools, strange beliefs, and it all seemed to end like this, broken and bleeding under the vast, empty sky. His duty was clear. This was not his fight. These were not his people. To involve himself was to invite trouble. The cavalry would come eventually, and they never cared to distinguish one Indian from another. To them, a brown face was a target. He began to turn away, to let the desert swallow this tragedy as it swallowed all things. But something caught his eye, a single set of tracks, small and unshod, leading away from the massacre. They were erratic, stumbling, the tracks of someone running in blind terror. He saw where the person had fallen, a smudge in the sand, then gotten up and staggered on. Curiosity, a dangerous thing in this land, pricked at him. It was a loose thread in the tapestry of the night's violence. Who had survived, and where did they think they were going? He followed. The tracks led him away from the wreckage, over a ridge and into a shallow arroyo. The scent of blood was stronger here. He moved with heightened caution, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. The moonlight poured into the wash, making the pale sand glow. And then he saw her. She was lying at the base of a large palo verde tree, its delicate leaves casting a lace-like shadow over her. For a moment, his mind could not process the image. It was surreal, a vision from a fever dream. A white girl, lying completely exposed under the stark, silver light of the moon. Her body was pale, almost luminous against the dark earth. She was on her side, curled into a defensive posture, as if trying to make herself small, to disappear. He could see she was young, perhaps 18 or 19 summers. Her hair, the color of corn silk, was fanned out in the sand, matted with dirt and something dark that could only be blood. Her entire body was a canvas of suffering. Long, cruel scratches ran down her back and legs, carved by the thorny brush she must have run through. Dark bruises blossomed on her skin like sinister flowers. She was utterly still. He watched her for a full minute, waiting for the rise and fall of her chest. It came, but it was so shallow, so faint, that it was almost imperceptible. She was alive, but only just. Kai stood frozen, a statue of bronze and leather in the moonlight, everything in him, every instinct honed by years of survival and loyalty to his tribe, screamed at him to turn around and walk away. This was not a survivor. This was a ghost, a white ghost, the most dangerous kind. She was a Bilagana. Her people had driven his from their ancestral lands, slaughtered their sheep, and forced them onto reservations that were little more than prisons of dust and despair. Her kind looked at him and saw a savage, a heathen, something less than human. To help her would be a betrayal of his own people's suffering. If she were found with him, the soldiers would not ask questions. They would see a Navajo warrior and a white girl and write their own story with bullets. He would be a kidnapper, a murderer. They would hunt him, and if they found him, they might not stop with him. They might bring their fire and steel to his family, his clan. He looked down at her. The moonlight softened the sharp edges of the world, but it did nothing to soften her plight. It only highlighted her terrifying vulnerability. She had been stripped of everything: her family, her clothes, her dignity. She was nothing more than a broken human creature, left to die in the sand. The men who had done this had not just killed her family. They had tried to erase her very humanity before leaving her for the coyotes. A war raged within him, silent and vicious. The warrior, the protector of the dying, saw a threat, a liability, a symbol of his enemy. He saw the faces of the blue-coated soldiers, the glint in the eyes of the land-hungry settlers. He felt the ancient anger of his ancestors, a fire that always smoldered in his chest. Leaving her was the smart choice. It was the safe choice. It was the choice of a survivor. But another part of him, a part he rarely acknowledged, saw something else. It saw not a white girl, but a girl. It saw the slender line of her back, the fragile look of her bare feet. It saw the way a single strand of her pale hair clung to her cheek. The spirits he had come to hunt tonight were spirits of cunning and survival. But what of the spirit of mercy? Did that have no place in this harsh land? The moon seemed to hang directly over them, a silent, all-seeing eye. An old story, told by a grandmother with a face like a dried apple, surfaced in his memory. She had said that the moon could sometimes lay a curse on a man's heart, making him do things that defied all logic, making him see a path where his feet were not meant to tread. He looked at the torn flesh on her arms, the dirt ground into her skin. He imagined her desperate flight through the darkness, the thorns tearing at her, her heart pounding with a terror he could only guess at. She had fought to live. Her flight, however hopeless, was a prayer for one more sunrise. Could he be the one to deny it? The conflict tore at him, a physical pain in his chest. His hand went from his knife to the deerskin pouch at his belt. Duty, survival, anger, vengeance. These were the stones upon which his life had been built. To pick up this girl would be to cast them all aside. He took a slow breath, the cool night air doing little to calm the fire in his mind. He looked up at the moon, its light so bright it felt like a judgment. Then his gaze returned to the girl. A small, ragged breath escaped her lips, a sound so fragile it was nearly lost in the vastness of the desert. It was that sound that made the choice for him. It was the sound of life, however faint, refusing to surrender. The warrior in him lost the battle, or perhaps the man in him won. With a final, resigned sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all the trouble that was to come, Kai unslung his bow and quiver, laying them carefully on the sand. He untied the rolled wolf pelt from his back, a thick, warm skin that was his only comfort against the cold desert nights. With slow, deliberate movements, he knelt beside the unconscious girl. For a moment, he hesitated, his hands hovering over her. Then, gently, he wrapped the dark, heavy pelt around her pale, broken body, covering her from the cold judgment of the moon and the unforgiving wilderness that had sought to claim her. As he lifted her into his arms, her weight was a startling combination of fragility and deadened burden. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow, that he was not just lifting a girl, he was lifting a destiny, a trouble so profound it would change the course of his life forever. The weight of her was the first surprise. She was a slip of a thing, yet in his arms, she felt as heavy as a stone, a solid anchor of trouble threatening to drag him down. Kai moved with a new urgency, his hunt for the coyote spirit forgotten, replaced by a more primal and infinitely more dangerous quest, finding shelter before the sun returned to reclaim the desert. He could not take her to his people's camp, to bring this white woman, this living proof of the Bilagana's tragedy, into their hidden hogans would be like carrying a lit torch into a cache of gunpowder. It would invite questions, then soldiers, then death. He was on his own. The thought was as cold and sharp as a sliver of flint. He shifted her weight, pulling the wolf pelt tighter around her. The scent of her blood, fear sweat, and the faint, foreign smell of soap that clung to her skin even now filled his senses. It was the scent of another world, a world of fences and farms, of churches and towns, a world that was relentlessly encroaching on his own. And here he was, carrying its wounded heart through the night. His mind worked as his legs moved, charting a course born of instinct and intimate knowledge of the land. There was a place, a half-day's walk to the north, a series of shallow caves carved into the side of a red rock mesa by 1,000 years of wind and water. He had used them before to wait out sandstorms or to dress a kill. They were well hidden, with a view of the surrounding plains and, most importantly, a small, stubborn seep of water that trickled from the rock, enough to sustain life. It was a place of solitude. Now, it would be a place of secrets. The journey was a quiet, grueling ordeal. The desert at night was not empty. The rustle of a pack rat in the brush, the low hoot of an owl, the distant, yipping chorus of coyotes sounds he normally found comforting now seemed like potential accusers. Every shadow could be a watcher. Every gust of wind could be carrying his scent to a patrol. He was a warrior, accustomed to moving unseen. But carrying the girl made him clumsy, vulnerable. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her breathing a constant, fragile whisper against his ear. He tried to think of her as just a burden, a sack of grain, a bundle of hides. But the warmth of her body seeped through the pelt, a human warmth that was impossible to ignore. It was a complication he resented. He walked without stopping, his muscles burning, his focus narrowed to the next step, the next patch of solid ground. The moon began its descent, and the first hint of gray appeared on the eastern horizon. He had to be out of sight before sunrise. Pushing himself harder, he finally reached the base of the mesa just as the sky was turning a bruised purple. He found the familiar path, a narrow, winding game trail that led up the rock face, and began the slow, careful climb. The cave was more of a deep rock shelter, a scooped-out hollow with a sandy floor, protected from the sky and the wind. It was cool and smelled of dry dust and ancient stone. With a grunt of relief, he knelt and gently laid her down in the deepest part of the recess. For a moment he stood over her, his chest heaving, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of the wolf pelt that covered her. The choice was made. The deed was done. Now came the consequences. He turned his attention to survival. He took his water skin to the back of the cave where the rock face was dark with moisture and held it under the slow, steady asterisk drip, drip, drip asterisk of the seep. It would take hours to fill. While it collected, he gathered dry brush and wood from the base of the mesa, enough for a small, smokeless fire, should they need it. He worked with a grim, detached efficiency, his mind a fortress against the torrent of questions that threatened to overwhelm him. As the sun climbed, painting the desert in hues of orange and rose, the cave grew lighter. He could see her more clearly now. He needed to know the extent of her injuries. Steeling himself, he knelt beside her again. He gently pulled back the wolf pelt. In the soft, indirect light, her pallor was alarming. The bruises on her arms and torso were a violent purple and black. The scratches were deep, caked with dried blood and dirt. An infection would kill her as surely as a bullet. He needed to clean them, using a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt and the precious water he'd collected. He began the slow, methodical task. He worked with the same impersonal care he would use to clean a wound on a horse, his touch firm and functional. He avoided looking at her face. It was easier to think of her as a task, a problem to be solved. But the problem had a name. Her name was Annabelle Miller, and even in the depths of her unconsciousness, she was reliving the end of her world. Her mind was a storm of fractured images and sounds. She was back in Missouri, the air thick with the smell of summer rain and her mother's baking bread. She saw her father, the Reverend Thomas Miller, his face alight with passion as he stood in the pulpit, his voice a booming certainty as he spoke of a promised land in the West, a new Eden in California where they could build a new church, a new life. He was a man of unshakable faith, and his faith was contagious. He had convinced his whole congregation, a dozen families, to sell their farms and follow him into the setting sun. The memories shifted, becoming a montage of the journey. The endless rumble of the wagon wheels, the creak of the wood and leather, the taste of dust on her tongue, the wide, optimistic faces of her friends, the hopeful songs they sang around the campfire at night. Her father would read from the Bible, his voice a comforting balm against the vast, intimidating darkness of the plains. Annabelle, at 18, was caught between the grief of leaving her childhood home and the thrilling promise of a future she could write for herself. She dreamed of the ocean, of a small house with a garden, of a life less circumscribed than the one she'd known. Then the storm broke, the memories sharpened with the terrifying clarity of trauma. The hot, still afternoon, the narrow canyon, the sudden, hideous shriek of a man's voice from the rocks above. The first gunshot, a sound that cracked the world in two. Chaos, horses screaming, men shouting. The faces that appeared over the sides of the wagon were not human faces. They were masks of snarling, bearded hatred, their eyes lit with a terrible, gleeful cruelty. She remembered her father, standing tall, holding his Bible like a shield, trying to reason with them. "We are people of God, we mean you no harm." A laugh, rough and ugly, was his only answer. Followed by another explosion of sound, she saw him fall. She saw her mother scream, a sound of pure, soul-shattering anguish. Before she too was pulled down, someone grabbed Annabelle, a hand tangled in her hair, another tearing at the bodice of her dress. The smell of whiskey and unwashed bodies, panic, pure and absolute, gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. She twisted, kicked, bit down on a fleshy hand, tasting blood. For a second, she was free, and she ran. She scrambled out of the back of the wagon and just ran, not looking back. The sounds of the massacre chasing her, clawing at her heels, the screams, the shots, the brutal laughter. She ran into the thorny brush, the branches tearing at her skin and clothes, but she didn't feel it. She only felt the desperate, animal need to escape, to put distance between herself and that waking nightmare. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, until the world dissolved into a black, roaring tide that pulled her under. Kai finished cleaning the last of the cuts on her legs. He had found a deeper gash on her scalp, hidden by her hair, which he had washed as best he could. He had done all he could do. Now it was up to the spirits, or her God, whichever had more power in this forsaken land. He sat back on his heels, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. He had not slept. He watched her, his expression unreadable. This girl, Annabelle, was the daughter of a preacher, a holy man. He thought of his own spiritual leaders, the Hatali, the medicine men who held the songs and ceremonies that kept his people in balance with the world. The bandits had killed her holy man without a second thought. It was a world without balance, a world gone mad. And he, Kai, had just tied himself to its madness. He felt a deep, abiding anger. Not at the girl, she was as much a victim as the deer caught in a rock slide. His anger was at the world that had thrown her in his path. It was at the bandits for their senseless slaughter. It was at the soldiers for creating a world where such things could happen. It was at his own heart for its moment of weakness. He had followed the path of his ancestors, the path of the warrior, his entire life. It was a clear, if hard, path. Stay with your people. Defend your people. Survive for your people. Now, he was in an unknown country. By saving this girl, he had betrayed the simplicity of his duty. He had chosen one life over the safety of the many. He had listened to a voice that was not the voice of his tribe. He looked at her pale, still face and saw not a person, but the embodiment of his dilemma. She was his secret. She was his burden. She was his crime. He rose and moved to the mouth of the cave. Standing just inside the shadows, looking out at the vast, sun-drenched expanse of the desert, he was a keeper of a fragile flame in a land of wind. And he knew, with the dead certainty of a prophet, that the wind was coming for him. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a series of sharp, painful fragments. The first was the feeling of rough stone against her cheek. The second was a thirst so profound it felt as if her throat were lined with sand. The third was the smell dust, wood smoke, and something else, something wild and musky. Annabelle's eyelids fluttered open, heavy as lead shutters. She was in a cave. Filtered daylight illuminated the space, revealing walls of red rock and a floor of fine sand. A small, disciplined fire crackled near the entrance, its flames nearly invisible in the brightness. And sitting on the other side of that fire, cross-legged and perfectly still, was a man. He was an Indian. His skin was the color of baked earth, his long black hair held back by a leather band. He wore no shirt, only deerskin leggings and moccasins. The muscles in his back and shoulders were taut and defined. In his hands, he was methodically sharpening the blade of a long knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic asterisk shh asterisk of the action the only sound besides the fire. For a heartbeat, Annabelle's mind was a blank slate. Then memory crashed down on her like a physical blow. The canyon, the ambush, the snarling faces, her father's fall, her mother's scream, her desperate, tearing flight through the brush, the blackness. A choked gasp escaped her lips. The man's hands stilled. He lifted his head, and his eyes met hers. They were dark, unreadable, and held no warmth. They were the eyes of the wilderness itself. Terror, cold and absolute, seized her. Every story she had ever heard, whispered in hushed tones back in Missouri tales of savage raids. A brutality beyond the comprehension of a civilized folk came rushing to the forefront of her mind. He was one of them, a wild man, a heathen. He had captured her. With a cry, she scrambled backward, crab walking away from him until her back hit the solid wall of the cave. She clutched the heavy fur-lined hide that covered her, pulling it up to her chin like a shield. It smelled of him, of smoke and the wild. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice a raw, broken whisper. "Where am I? What have you done with me?" The Navajo warrior watched her, his expression unchanging. He placed the knife and stone carefully on the ground beside him. He did not rise. He did not threaten. He simply watched her, his silence more unnerving than any threat could have been. "Stay away from me," she cried, her voice gaining a hysterical edge. She was trapped. Her body ached with a profound, bone-deep weariness, and she knew she had no strength to fight or flee. The man finally spoke, his voice a low baritone, the words in English but heavily accented and strangely spaced. "You, safe, here." The words meant nothing to her. Safe? How could she be safe with him? He was the very thing her father had warned her about, the embodiment of the godless savagery that lurked beyond the edges of their world. "You're lying," she spat, her fear curdling into a desperate, impotent anger. "You're a savage." The word hung in the air between them. Kai's face did not flicker. He had been called that word before, often accompanied by the glint of a rifle barrel. To hear it from this broken, terrified girl was nothing. He had seen her people do things that made the word meaningless. He simply turned his attention back to the fire, adding a small piece of wood to the coals. His dismissal of her, his utter lack of reaction was more confounding than any act of aggression. It was as if her fear, her very existence, was a minor inconvenience. The first day was a silent war. Annabelle refused to move from her spot against the back wall. Thirst gnawed at her, but she would not ask him for water. Hunger made her stomach cramp. but she would not accept anything from his hands. She watched his every move, convinced that any moment he would reveal his true, brutal nature. But he did nothing. He tended the fire. He checked the sky. He sat for what seemed like hours, simply being as still and patient as the rock of the mesa itself. Late in the afternoon, the thirst became an agony she could no longer bear. She was lightheaded, her vision swimming. She saw him rise and pick up a water skin. He walked not towards her, but towards the cave entrance. He was leaving. The thought sparked a new wave of panic. As monstrous as he was her only link to this world. To be left alone was to be left to die. He paused at the edge of the light and looked back at her. He gestured with his head. "Come." She hesitated, torn between her fear of him and her fear of being abandoned. The thirst made the decision for her. Trembling, she got to her feet, clutching the heavy pelt around her like a royal robe. Her legs were weak, and she stumbled. He waited, his patience infuriating. Outside, the heat and light were a physical assault. She squinted, her eyes watering. He led her a short distance from the cave to a large, barrel-shaped cactus. From a leather pouch at his belt, he produced a piece of sharpened flint and began to methodically cut a chunk from the top of the plant. He worked with an economy of motion, wasting no energy. He carved out the white, fleshy pulp inside, placing it on a flat rock. He gestured for her to eat it. She stared at the offering, suspicious. He seemed to understand. He picked up a piece himself and put it in his own mouth, chewing slowly. It was a clear demonstration asterisk. This is safe, this is water. Her throat was so dry she could barely swallow. Hesitantly, she reached for a piece of the pulp. It was surprisingly moist, with a slightly sweet, green taste. It wasn't water, but it was life. She ate ravenously, the cool liquid soothing the fire in her throat. He watched her, his dark eyes betraying nothing, before turning to cut more. He was not her captor. She realized with a jolt of confusion. He was her keeper. He was teaching her how to live in this place that was designed to kill her. The days that followed fell into a harsh, simple rhythm, a routine of pure survival. Kai was a silent, demanding teacher. He never offered comfort, only instruction. He showed her which plants were poison and which could be made into a soothing poultice for her cuts. He taught her how to fashion a crude sunshade from a smaller hide he provided, stretching it between two rocks to create a patch of deep, cool shadow where she could escape the midday furnace. One morning, he handed her a length of cord made from yucca fiber and, through gestures, showed her how to set a simple snare for rabbits along a game trail. She fumbled with the knot, her fingers clumsy and weak. He watched her for a moment, then knelt, his large, calloused hands guiding hers, showing her how to form the loop, how to place the trigger stick. His touch was impersonal, the touch of a craftsman instructing an apprentice. But the brief contact sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. It was the first human touch she had felt since she had lost her family. He would leave for hours at a time to Hana, his lithe form disappearing into the shimmering heat waves of the desert. Her fear would return then, a gnawing anxiety that he would not come back. She would sit in the mouth of the cave, scanning the horizon, her existence hanging on the thread of his return. And when she would finally spot him, a distant, dark figure, moving steadily towards her with a rabbit or a brace of quail slung over his shoulder, the feeling that washed over her was not fear. It was a complex, shameful, and undeniable relief. He was keeping her alive. The realization was a slow dawn, fighting against the dark clouds of her prejudice. This man, whom she had called a savage, was more attuned to the world than anyone she had ever known. He moved through the harsh landscape not as an enemy, but as a part of it. There was a quiet dignity in the way he lived, a respect for the world that provided for him. He was not the monster of her stories. The monsters were the white men with the whiskey on their breath and the laughter in their eyes. They had destroyed, This man, Kai, only preserved. Yet the chasm between them remained. They were two separate worlds, sharing a tiny patch of shade. But the nights were when the chasm felt widest. The desert cold was a living thing, seeping from the ground, stealing the heat from her body. The small fire helped, but her simple cotton shift, which he had retrieved for her from the wreckage, and she had mended, offered little protection. She would lie awake for hours, curled into a tight ball, shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. One night, the cold was worse than ever. A dry wind had picked up, cutting through the cave. She had wrapped the wolf pelt around herself, but it wasn't enough. She was shaking in violent, racking spasms, trying to muffle the sounds so he wouldn't hear her. He was sitting by the fire, as he always did, a silent guardian against the darkness. She saw his head turn slightly in her direction. In the flickering firelight, his face was a mask of shadow and light. For a long moment, he did not move. Then, he rose. Annabelle tensed, her heart hammering against her ribs. He walked over to where he slept, on the bare sand with only a small deerskin for a pillow. He picked up the thick wolf pelt, the one he had first wrapped her in, the one that was his only blanket, his only comfort against the cold. He came to her side. She flinched as he knelt, expecting, she didn't know what. He didn't speak. He simply took the pelt from her shaking hands, shook it out, and then draped it carefully over her. Then, he took his own wolf pelt and laid it over the first one, tucking the edges around her body, cocooning her in a double layer of thick, warm fur. The effect was immediate. The violent shivering subsided, replaced by a deep, penetrating warmth. The heavy weight of the pelts was comforting, a shield against the vast, cold emptiness of the night. He had given her his own covering. He would now face the cold with nothing. He stood up and returned to his spot by the fire, sitting with his back to her, staring into the flames as if nothing had happened. Annabelle lay there, swaddled in warmth, and stared at his unmoving back, an act of such simple, selfless compassion. He had asked for nothing. He had said nothing. He had simply seen her need and met it, sacrificing his own comfort without a moment's hesitation. Tears, hot and silent, began to well in her eyes and trail down her temples into her hair. They were not tears of fear or grief. They were tears of a profound, shattering confusion. Everything she thought she knew was wrong. This was not a savage. This was not a monster. This was a man. A man who, day after day, in his own silent, stoic way, was pulling her back from the brink of death. He was the flame in the desert, a small, steady light that held the darkness at bay. And for the first time, as she drifted into a deep, warm sleep, she wasn't afraid of the man on the other side of the fire. She was humbled by him. The passing of several weeks had worn a new shape to their existence. The raw edges of terror and mistrust had been smoothed down by the steady, grinding rhythm of survival. Annabelle's body, nourished by the rabbit and quail Kai hunted and the desert plants he taught her to identify, had begun to heal. The deep scratches had faded to pale white lines against her sun-darkened skin, and a new, wiry strength had settled in her limbs. She was no longer the fragile, broken thing Kai had found under the moon. She was becoming a creature of this new, harsh world. Their silence was no longer a wall between them, but a language of its own. She learned the meaning of his stillness, the subtle shift in his posture that meant a hawk was circling overhead, the slight narrowing of his eyes that spoke of a change in the weather. He, in turn, had come to understand the language of her sighs, the dip in her shoulders that meant her grief was a heavy cloak that day, the rare, fleeting smile that touched her lips when a vibrant desert flower bloomed against all odds. They were two solitary planets, drawn into a shared, silent orbit by a force neither understood. One afternoon, they sat in the shade at the mouth of the cave, working in tandem. He was refletching an arrow, his long fingers moving with practiced precision. While she was using a sharp piece of flint to scrape a rabbit hide he had tasked her with cleaning. The work was mundane. Yet there was a fragile peace in it, a sense of shared purpose that felt almost like domesticity. In that moment, watching his focused expression as he worked, the sun warming the rock behind her, Annabelle felt a sensation she had thought was lost to her forever, a feeling of safety. The world was still a place of terrible ghosts and uncertain futures, but this small pocket of existence, this cave governed by the quiet competence of the man beside her, felt like a sanctuary. It was Kai who felt it first. He suddenly went rigid, his hands ceasing their work, his head lifted, his gaze fixed on the distant, shimmering horizon. He was like a deer that had caught the scent of a wolf on the wind, every muscle in his body taut with an immediate, primal alertness. "What is it?" Annabelle whispered, her own heart beginning to beat faster at the sight of his alarm. He didn't answer. He rose to his feet in a single fluid motion and stepped to the edge of the overlook, shielding his eyes against the brutal sun. Annabelle followed, her gaze trying to find what he saw. At first, there was nothing but the endless expanse of sand and rock. Then she saw it, a faint, hazy plume of dust rising in the distance, a dirty smudge against the pristine blue sky. Her blood ran cold. Dust meant horses, and out here, horses in number meant only one thing. Kai turned to her, and for the first time, she saw something akin to urgency in his dark eyes. "Inside," he commanded, his voice a low, sharp rasp. He didn't say hide, but the meaning was clear. He pointed to the deepest, darkest recess of the cave. "Stay. Do not make a sound." He began to move with a speed and purpose that was terrifying to behold. He kicked sand over their small fire, extinguishing it instantly. He gathered their few implements, the snares, the waterskin, the hides, and shoved them into a crevice. He was erasing them, trying to make the desert swallow all evidence of their existence. Annabelle scrambled to the back of the cave, her sanctuary now feeling like a trap. She crouched in the shadows, peering out, her hands pressed against her mouth to stifle her own ragged breathing. The dust cloud grew larger, resolving itself into distinct shapes. 4 riders, moving at a steady trot. The sun glinted off a rifle barrel, off the brass buttons of a uniform. They were cavalry, blue-coated soldiers of the United States Army. Annabelle's heart leaped with a wild, confusing surge of hope and fear. Rescue. It was rescue. These were her people, her saviors. They would take her away from this wilderness, back to civilization. But as she watched Kai stand at the mouth of the cave, his bow now in his hand, his body a tense silhouette against the bright light, the hope curdled into a sickening dread. The soldiers would not see a savior. They would see a savage. The patrol reined in their horses at the base of the mesa. Annabelle could hear the jingle of their harnesses, the snort of a tired horse. A man with sergeant's stripes on his sleeve dismounted, his eyes scanning the rocks. "Hold up," the sergeant called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Tracks, moccasins, fresh ones." Another soldier, younger, with a sparse blonde mustache, pointed up towards the cave. "Something up there, Sarge. Looks like a shelter." The sergeant drew his Colt revolver. "All right, Corporal. You and Jones stay with the horses. Evans, you're with me. Let's see what kind of varmint we've got hiding in our jurisdiction." Annabelle watched, paralyzed, as the 2 blue-coated figures began to climb the trail. Their boots scraping on the rock, they moved with a clumsy certainty, rifles held at the ready. Kai did not move. He stood just inside the shadows of the cave entrance, an arrow resting loosely on his bowstring. Waiting. He was giving them a chance to pass, a chance to miss him, a chance that was never going to come. The sergeant reached the ledge first. He saw Kai instantly. Well, what have we here?" he said, a contemptuous sneer in his voice as he raised his revolver. "Don't you move an inch, Chief." The other soldier, Evans came up behind him, his rifle pointing directly at Kai's chest. It was then that his eyes adjusted to the dimness of the cave, and he saw Annabelle, huddled in the back. His face registered shock, then outrage.
"Sergeant, my God! Look, it's a white woman! He's got a hostage!"
The sergeant's face hardened, his eyes turning to chips of ice. The entire situation snapped into a simple, ugly picture in his mind, a savage Navajo buck who had kidnapped a settler's daughter. There was no need for questions, no room for doubt. It was a story as old as the frontier itself. "Let the girl go. You red devil," the sergeant roared, taking a step forward. "Let her go now, or I'll put a hole in you so big the buzzards can fly through it." Kai didn't understand the flood of words, but he understood the raised weapons, the hate-filled eyes. He understood this was a conversation that could only end in blood. He glanced back at Annabelle, his expression unreadable, and then his gaze settled on the soldiers. He gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. It was all the answer they needed. What happened next was a blur of terrible, swift violence. The sergeant took another step, and Kai moved. He was not a man anymore. He was a force of nature, an explosion of coiled energy. The bow came up, the string drawn back to his ear in a single, fluid motion. The arrow hissed through the air, a streak of deadly grace. It struck the younger soldier, Evans, in the shoulder, spinning him around with a cry of pain and shock. He went down, his rifle clattering on the rocks. The sergeant fired his revolver. The shot was deafening in the confined space, the bullet whining off the rock wall inches from Kai's head, showering him with stone fragments. Before the sergeant could fire again, Kai had dropped his bow and launched himself forward, his hunting knife seeming to leap into his hand. He moved low and fast, a brown blur against the red rock. He crashed into the sergeant, driving him backward onto the ledge. Annabelle screamed. It was a raw, primal struggle. The sergeant was bigger, heavier, but Kai was faster, imbued with a desperate, wiry strength. They grappled on the edge of the cliff, a tangle of limbs and grunts of effort. The sergeant's pistol flew from his grasp, skittering over the edge and disappearing. From below, the other two soldiers started firing their rifles. Bullets smacked into the rock around the cave, forcing Annabelle to press herself flat against the wall. She watched in horror as Kai and the sergeant swayed on the precipice. Kai's knife flashed. The sergeant cried out, a sound of agony and surprise. For a moment, they were frozen in a grim tableau. And then Kai shoved with all his might. The sergeant lost his footing, his arms flailing, and tumbled backward off the ledge, his scream cut short by a sickening thud from below. Kai stood panting, his chest heaving. Blood trickled from a shallow gash on his forearm where the sergeant's belt buckle had scraped him. He was not unscathed. He snatched up his bow and peered over the edge. The two soldiers below were in disarray, one attending to the man who had fallen, the other firing wildly up at the cave. Kai knocked another arrow, took aim, and let it fly. It was not a killing shot. The arrow buried itself in the sand just in front of the horses. The animals shrieked in terror, rearing and pulling at their reins. The soldier who had been firing dropped his rifle and scrambled to control the panicked mounts. It was the opening Kai needed. "We go," he grunted, grabbing Annabelle's arm. "Now." He pulled her out of the cave and pushed her towards a narrow fissure in the rock face she had never noticed before, a path that led up and over the top of the mesa. He followed close behind her, his bow in one hand, periodically glancing back to ensure they weren't being pursued. Annabelle's mind was a maelstrom of shock and horror. She scrambled up the rocks, her hands raw, her lungs burning. The sounds of the fight echoed in her ears, the gunshot, the screams, the sickening finality of the sergeant's fall. He had killed him. Kai had killed an American soldier. For her. They reached the top of the mesa and ran, stumbling over the uneven, rocky ground. They didn't stop until the sounds from below had faded completely, until they were utterly alone with the wind and the sky. They finally collapsed behind a cluster of large boulders, hidden from view. Annabelle stared at him. He was leaning against a rock, tending to the cut on his arm, his face a grim mask of concentration. The blood on his skin was a stark, vivid red, the blood of her people. A wave of nausea and guilt so powerful it buckled her knees washed over her. Those men, they were soldiers. They were symbols of order, of the world she belonged to. They had seen her and thought she was in danger. They had died or been wounded, or run off trying to rescue her. And she had stood by, hidden in the shadows, while the man they saw as her captor fought and killed them to protect her. She was the cause. Her presence here, her life, had brought this bloodshed. Kai had saved her from the bandits. He had saved her from the desert. And now he had saved her from her own countrymen. He had stained the sand with their blood, all for her. The clear, simple lines of her world had shattered into a million pieces. Who were the savages now, the men who saw a situation and opened fire without a single question, or the man who had shown her nothing but quiet, life-sustaining care, only to be forced into brutal violence? She looked at Kai, the silent warrior, the killer, the protector. He was an outcast from his world because of her, and in that moment, she had become an outcast from her own. She was a traitor, her loyalties hopelessly, tragically divided. The fragile sanctuary of their cave was gone, destroyed by the intrusion of the very world she had once yearned for. A seed of tragedy had been planted in the red desert soil that day, watered by the blood of men in blue coats, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that she and the man before her would be the ones to reap its bitter harvest. They were ghosts now, haunting the far edges of the territory. The violent encounter with the cavalry had shattered their fragile peace and cast them into a new, more desperate existence. They were no longer just hiding, they were running. Every distant dust cloud was a potential patrol, every campfire at night a potential enemy. Kai's knowledge of the land was the only thing that kept them alive. He led them through labyrinthine canyons, over barren mesas, and across dry lake beds where the heat distorted the world into a shimmering mirage. He moved with a relentless, grim purpose, his senses perpetually on high alert. The shared danger forged a new intimacy between them, one born of absolute necessity. Annabelle learned to walk as he did, placing her feet carefully to leave the faintest of tracks. She learned to read his hand signals from a distance, a flat palm for asterisk, get down, asterisk. A beckoning finger for asterisk, come quickly, asterisk. They were a silent, efficient team, their lives intertwined in a dance of survival. The distance he had once maintained between them had evaporated. He was no longer just her keeper. He was her shield, her guide, her only fixed point in a world that had come completely unmoored. For Annabelle, the guilt was a constant companion, a shadow that followed her even under the midday sun. Kai was a fugitive because of her. He had shed the blood of her countrymen for her. He had abandoned the relative safety of his known territory and was now an exile in his own land, all to protect a white woman who had brought nothing but disaster into his life. The debt she owed him was immeasurable, a weight that settled deep in her soul. But beneath the guilt, something else was taking root. A feeling as tenacious and powerful as a desert flower blooming from a crack in a rock. She would watch him as he moved, marveling at the grace and power in his lean form. She would see the way his eyes, so often hard and unreadable, would soften slightly when he looked at a sunset, or the way a small, almost imperceptible muscle in his jaw would tighten when he was deep in thought. He was no longer just an Indian, a silent protector. He was Kai, a man of quiet strength, profound competence, and a hidden well of compassion she had been privileged to see. She was beginning to realize, with a feeling that was equal parts terrifying and exhilarating, that the debt she felt was turning into something that looked dangerously like love. They had been on the move for nearly a moon cycle when they found a place of temporary respite, a small, hidden canyon with a stream of clear, cold water running through it, lined with cottonwood trees whose leaves rustled in the breeze. It felt like paradise, a secret garden in the heart of the inferno. For the first time in weeks, they could relax their vigilance, if only for a few days. They made a camp under a rocky overhang, and the sound of running water was a balm to their frayed nerves. One night, the moon returned to its full, silver glory, flooding the canyon with a soft, ethereal light. It was an exact echo of the night he had found her, and the symmetry of it was not lost on Annabelle. She lay on her bedroll, watching the moonlight play through the cottonwood leaves, casting shifting patterns on the canyon wall. Kai sat a short distance away, his back against a boulder, staring up at the celestial disk. He looked solitary, a man burdened by thoughts he would never share. The question had been in her heart for weeks, a constant, unspoken presence. Tonight, under the silent witness of the same moon that had presided over her ruin and her salvation, it demanded to be asked. She rose from her bedroll, her bare feet making no sound on the soft sand. She approached him quietly and sat down a few feet away, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. For a long time, they sat in a shared silence, watching the moon. Finally, she broke it, her voice barely a whisper, afraid that a louder sound might shatter the fragile peace of the moment. Kai. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes reflecting the moonlight. That first night, she began, her voice trembling slightly. The men who attacked my family's wagon, they were white men. The soldiers who came to the cave, they were white men. Your people and my people, they are enemies. Everything in this world told you to leave me in the sand. Every law, every prejudice, every instinct for your own survival. She paused, gathering her courage. So why didn't you? Why did you save me? Why did you? He was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. He turned his gaze back to the moon, his profile etched in silver and shadow. The life of a warrior was one of clear lines and hard duties. Protect the people, provide for the people, avenge the people. His actions that night had defied all of it. He had traded the safety of his world for the life of a single person, an enemy. He had tried to explain it to himself 100 times and failed. There was no logic to it. There was only the image, burned into his mind, of her lying broken under the moonlight. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. I do not know, he said, the English words feeling heavy and inadequate on his tongue. He looked at her then, and his gaze was so direct, so intense, that she felt it like a physical touch. I have asked the spirits. I have asked my own heart. There is no warrior's reason. He took a breath. I only know that when I saw you, lying there under the moon, I saw something that felt more important than my tribe, more important than my own life. The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. Asterisk, more important than my tribe. For a man like Kai, a man whose entire identity was woven into the fabric of his people, it was the most profound confession imaginable. It was a declaration that defied everything he was supposed to be. He hadn't saved her out of pity or a sense of abstract honor. He had saved her for a reason that was personal, elemental, and utterly irrational. He had saved her for her asterisk. The air between them changed, charged with the power of his admission. The unspoken thing that had been growing in the spaces of their silence was finally out in the open. A living, breathing entity. The chasm of race and culture and history that separated them suddenly seemed insignificant next to the raw, terrifying truth of what he had just said. He had turned his back on his world for her. Now, she would turn her back on hers. Annabelle felt the last of her fear, the last of her hesitation, fall away. All that was left was the overwhelming certainty of her own heart, in a world that had taken everything from her. This man had been her one constant, her one source of safety. He had seen her at her most broken, her most vulnerable, and had not only saved her but had now confessed that she meant more to him than life itself. She rose to her knees and moved the few feet that separated them. He watched her approach, his body still, his eyes wide with a new kind of vulnerability. She reached out a hesitant hand and laid it on his cheek. His skin was warm, rough with the weathering of sun and wind. He did not pull away. Instead, he leaned into her touch, a barely perceptible movement, and his eyes closed. It was all the invitation she needed. She leaned in and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of two worlds, a release of all the unspoken gratitude, fear, guilt, and longing that had simmered between them for weeks. It was the desperate, starved kiss of two people who had been utterly alone and had, against all odds, found a home in each other. His initial stillness gave way, and his arm came around her, pulling her close with a strength that made her gasp. He kissed her back with a fierce, possessive hunger that was both frightening and thrilling. It was the kiss of a man who had held his emotions in check for a lifetime and was now letting them break free. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. In the silver light, she could see the turmoil in his eyes. The stoic warrior was gone, replaced by a man who was trembling. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Without a word, she took his hand and led him back to her bedroll, to the small space under the overhang that had become her own. She lay down and pulled him with her, her heart pounding a wild, triumphant rhythm against her ribs. This was her choice, not an act of submission or surrender, but an act of claiming. She was claiming this man, this life, this love that had been forged in the crucible of the desert. He came to her, his movements hesitant at first, as if he were afraid this was a dream from which he would wake. She guided his hands, her own touch sure and steady. She unlaced his deerskin leggings, and he helped her with the simple ties of her mended shift the moment their skin touched. A jolt of pure, electric life passed between them. It was a shock of recognition, of rightness. In the quiet of the moonlit canyon, surrounded by the gentle murmur of the stream and the rustle of the cottonwood leaves, they came together. It was an act of profound tenderness and desperate discovery. For Annabelle, it was the erasure of the brutal hands that had tried to harm her, replaced by the careful, worshipful touch of a man who held her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe. For Kai, it was the breaking down of a lifetime of solitude, the discovery of a connection so powerful it shook the foundations of his soul. They moved together, learning the rhythm of each other's bodies, speaking a language older than any tribe or nation. It was a silent conversation of shared sorrow and newfound joy, a desperate affirmation of life in the face of so much death. In his arms, Annabelle was no longer the preacher's daughter, no longer a victim. She was simply a woman, whole and alive and fiercely loved. And as Kai held her, he was no longer just a warrior, a fugitive, a man caught between two worlds. He was her sanctuary, and she was his. Afterward, they lay tangled together, wrapped in the wolf pelts, their bodies slick with sweat, their breathing slowly returning to normal. Kai held her, his hand gently stroking her hair, his lips pressed against her temple. The hard lines of his face had softened, and in the pale light, he looked younger. The weight of his world momentarily lifted. Annabelle lay with her head on his chest, listening to the steady, powerful beat of his heart. It was the most comforting sound she had ever heard. They had crossed a final, irrevocable line. They were no longer protector and survivor. They were one heart, one soul, one shared fate, bound together under the silent, watchful eye of the moon. And whatever came next, they would face it together. Their time in the hidden canyon was a stolen dream, a fleeting breath between a past of horror and a future of uncertainty. But dreams, no matter how beautiful, must end when the sun rises. The real world with its hard edges and unforgiving laws, was patient. It was waiting for them. The intrusion came not as the thunder of cavalry hooves, but as a near-silent rustle in the cottonwood leaves. Kai felt it first, a subtle shift in the canyon's atmosphere. 3 men appeared at the mouth of the stream, materializing from the landscape as if born of the rock and shadow. They were Dine, his people. They were a hunting party, their bows held loosely in their hands, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and caution. And then they saw Annabelle. She was kneeling by the stream, washing a strip of rabbit meat, her pale hair a beacon in the dappled sunlight. 3 sets of dark eyes fixed on her. The curiosity vanished, replaced by a cold, hard shock. Their gaze shifted to Kai, who had risen slowly to his feet, his body placed protectively between them and Annabelle. The look they gave him was no longer one of kinship, but of confusion, and then a dawning, sharp-edged accusation. The leader of the trio stepped forward. He was an older man, his face a leathery mask of hard-won battles and deep-set beliefs. Scars traced patterns on his bare chest and arms, each one a testament to a clash with Mexicans, UTEs, or the blue-coated soldiers. This was Chayton, a man respected for his prowess as a warrior and feared for his unbending adherence to the old ways. He saw the world in absolutes Navajo and enemy, tradition and sacrilege. To him, the Bilagana were a pestilence, a creeping disease that had stolen their land, their sacred mountains, and their future. Chayton's eyes swept over the scene, the small, orderly camp, the 2 bedrolls lying near each other, the white woman wearing a mended dress, looking not like a prisoner but like a partner. His gaze, when it returned to Kai, was as hard and merciless as flint. "Brother," Chayton said, his voice a low growl that held no warmth. He spoke in the Dine language, the words sharp and percussive. "The spirits told us we would find a lost hunter. They did not tell us he had been ensnared by a ghost-faced witch." "She is no witch, Chayton," Kai replied, his own voice steady, though every muscle in his body was coiled tight. "She is a survivor. I found her near death." Chayton took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Annabelle, who had scrambled to her feet and now stood frozen behind Kai, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You found her," Chayton sneered. "And you kept her. You bring this omen into our lands. Have you forgotten the sickness they carry on their skin, the lies they carry on their tongues, the soldiers that follow them like flies to a corpse?" He gestured to his 2 companions. "Take him. We will bring him before the council. They will decide the price for this foolishness." Kai did not resist. To fight his own people here would be a dishonor he could not bear. It would only prove Chayton's accusations. He allowed them to take his bow and knife, his face an unreadable mask of stone. 2 warriors bound his wrists behind his back with a leather thong. As they pulled him forward, Chayton walked over to Annabelle. She flinched, expecting a blow, but he only looked at her with an expression of profound disgust, as if she were something unclean he had found crawling on the canyon floor. He spat on the ground near her feet and turned away, issuing a sharp command for her to follow. The journey back to the tribe's hidden encampment was a march of humiliation. Kai walked in silence, the leather biting into his wrists, his head held high. But inside, a storm of rage and despair was building. This was the consequence he had always feared, the trouble he had knowingly lifted into his arms. Annabelle stumbled behind him, prodded along by one of the younger warriors, her mind reeling with terror. She was being led into the heart of the world that had every reason to hate her. The curious, hostile stares of the women and children who emerged from their hogans as they entered the camp were like physical blows. They whispered and pointed, their faces a mixture of fear and contempt. They looked at her as if she were a harbinger of doom. The council convened as the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the small settlement. The elders, their faces creased with the wisdom and sorrow of their years, sat in a semicircle before a large central fire. Chaitin stood before them, his voice a powerful, resonant instrument of accusation. Kai was brought into the center of the circle and forced to his knees, his hands still bound. Annabelle was held at the edge of the circle by two stern-faced women, a prisoner in all but name. "This man, Kai, whom we have called brother and warrior," Chaitin began, his voice ringing with righteous fury, "has forgotten his duty. He has forgotten the blood of our ancestors that has been spilled by the Bilagana. He has forgotten the cries of our children who starved because the soldiers burned our fields and slaughtered our sheep." He paced before the fire, his shadow dancing like a vengeful spirit. He found one of them, a woman, the seed of our destroyers. And what did he do? Did he leave her to the desert, as is just? Did he treat her as the enemy she is? No, he took her in. He protected her. He lay with her as a man lies with a wife. The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. A murmur of shock and outrage rippled through the assembled crowd. "He has brought this contamination, this bad omen, to our very doorstep." Chaitin's voice rose to a roar. "How long before her people come looking for her? How long before the blue coats ride into this valley and burn our homes? As they have burned so many others, Kai has put his own selfish desire for this white-skinned creature above the survival of the Dina. He is a traitor to his blood, and he must be punished as a traitor." Chaitin finished, his chest heaving. His arm pointed directly at Kai. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. One of the oldest elders, a man named Hastian, finally spoke, his voice dry as winter leaves. "Kai, you have heard the accusation. What do you have to say in your defense?" Kai was pushed to his feet. He stood tall, his bound hands behind his back, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the men who were to judge him. "What Chaitin says is true," Kai began, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the tension. "I found her. I protected her. I have shared my fire and my food with her." He paused, his eyes finding Annabelle at the edge of the circle. "But she is not an omen. She is a woman whose family was slaughtered by men of her own color. She is a life, and I could not leave a life to be devoured by the vultures. My duty as a warrior is to protect the people, but my honor as a man is to protect the helpless. I have not betrayed my honor." "Honor?" Chaitin scoffed. "There is no honor in sleeping with the enemy. She has bewitched you with her pale skin and yellow hair." The council deliberated, their voices a low, serious murmur. Annabelle watched, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She couldn't understand the words, but she understood the language of hate in Chaitin's eyes, the grim, troubled expressions on the faces of the elders. She saw them look from her to Kai and back again. She was the evidence. She was the crime. Finally, Hastian rose. The firelight cast his ancient face in deep relief. "Kai, your heart has led you astray. The risk you have brought to this clan is too great to be ignored. You have defied the wisdom of our ways." He motioned to two warriors. "Tie him to the post. He will be left for 2 days without food or water to purify his spirit. Then we will decide if he is to be exiled." A wave of despair crashed over Annabelle. "No, not this. Not because of her." The warriors grabbed Kai, pulling him toward a thick wooden post set in the center of the clearing. He did not struggle. His eyes found hers one last time, and in their depths, she saw not anger, but a profound, heartbreaking resignation. "No," Annabelle cried out, the English word alien and shrill in the Navajo camp. "Please, don't, it's my fault. Let him go." She tried to run to him, but the two women holding her arms tightened their grip, their fingers digging into her flesh like talons. They spat words at her she didn't understand. "Yitz shid, bilagana ashki," but the venom in their voices was clear. Asterisk, bad omen. White devil. They shoved her backward, and she stumbled, falling to her knees in the dust. She looked up and saw Kai being tied to the post, his back straight, his face a mask of stoic endurance. She saw Chaitin watching her with a look of triumph. She saw the faces of the council. set and resolute. Pleading was useless. Logic was useless. They saw her as a thing, a symbol, a disease. They would let him suffer, perhaps let him die, to purge her influence. In that moment, something inside her broke. The fear, the grief, the guilt, it all coalesced into a single, white-hot point of pure, defiant resolve. She would not be a passive victim in his tragedy. She would not be the omen they named her. With a strength born of desperation, she wrenched her arm free from one of the women's grasp. She twisted and tore away from the other, ignoring the woman's cry of surprise. And then she ran. She ran into the center of the circle, her bare feet kicking up dust, her mended dress flying behind her. She ran past the shocked elders, past the furious Chaitin, and did not stop until she was standing directly in front of the post where Kai was bound. The entire tribe fell silent, staring at the brazen act of this white woman who had dared to invade their sacred council. She stood before them, trembling but unbowed, her chest heaving. She met Chaitin's murderous glare without flinching. Her eyes swept over the council, demanding they see her. Not as an omen, but as a person. She placed a hand on Kai's chest, on the warm, solid muscle and skin of the man she loved. "He is not my captor," she shouted, her voice ringing with a power she didn't know she possessed. The English words were meaningless to most, but her intent was not. She pointed from herself to Kai, shaking her head vehemently. "I am not his prisoner." She looked from the bound warrior to the faces of his judges. They had to understand. They had to know the truth that transcended language. She took a deep breath, and, with all the conviction in her soul, she made her final, irrevocable declaration. She turned her body, placing herself protectively in front of Kai, facing the entire tribe as his shield. "I am his," she cried, her voice breaking with the force of her emotion. She pressed her hand harder against his heart. "And he is mine. I love him." The word love hung in the air, a foreign and explosive concept. The stunned silence of the Navajo was absolute. They stared, wide-eyed, at the spectacle, the bound warrior and the white woman who claimed him, who defied them all, her body a fragile barrier against their judgment. Chaitin's face contorted, his look of triumph replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. This was not a plea for mercy. This was an act of war. The woman had not only corrupted their warrior, she had come into the heart of their nation and thrown down a challenge they could not ignore. The conflict had just escalated from a matter of tribal law to a battle for the very soul of their traditions. Annabelle's declaration hung in the twilight air, a shocking, impossible sound that silenced the entire tribe. The crackling of the central fire was suddenly deafening. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The image was indelible, the bound Navajo warrior, his body rigid with pride and pain, and the pale-haired white woman standing before him like a Valkyrie, her face streaked with dust and tears, her voice still echoing a word they did not know but a sentiment they could not mistake. The silence was shattered by Chaitin. He threw his head back and let out a harsh, barking laugh devoid of all humor. It was the sound of a predator that has finally cornered its prey. "Witchcraft," he roared, his voice thick with venom as he turned to the stunned elders. "Do you see now? It is not love. It is a sickness she has put in his mind. She speaks with a serpent's tongue, and he is so lost in her spell that he allows her to shame him, to shame us all." He strode into the center of the circle, his muscular body radiating a barely controlled violence. He pointed a trembling finger, not at Kai, but at Annabelle. "This is the poison the Bilagana use. Not just their rifles and their whiskey, but this. They send their women to soften the spines of our warriors, to make them forget who they are. She has made him her dog." He spun back to face the council, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire. "There is only one way to cleanse this poison, an old way, the way of steel and blood. Let the spirits judge who is true to the people." He ripped the knife from the sheath at his belt, its blade catching the firelight. He held it aloft. I, Chaitin, who has taken 20 enemy scalps for the honor of the Dine, challenge the traitor Kai to the Ta'ajilgo, the duel of loyalty. We will fight until one can no longer stand. Let the strength of a true Navajo heart decide this matter." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Trial by combat was a brutal and seldom invoked tradition, reserved for the gravest of betrayals. Hastian, the old elder, rose slowly to his feet, his face a mask of deep sorrow. He looked at Kai, still bound to the post, and then at the furious, unyielding face of Chaitin. He saw a clan on the verge of tearing itself apart. His gaze fell on Annabelle, the catalyst for it all. Perhaps Chaitin was right. This was a fire that could only be quenched with blood. With a heavy heart, Hastian gave a single solemn nod. Let it be so. A grim finality settled over the camp. The sun had touched the horizon, bleeding a fiery crimson stain across the western sky, bathing the entire scene in a blood-red light. It was a terrible and fitting omen. 2 warriors cut the leather thongs binding Kai's wrists. He rubbed the circulation back into his hands, his face impassive, but his eyes were fixed on Annabelle. She was being pulled away again, screaming his name, her struggles useless against the strong hands that held her. His heart tore at the sound. This was his doing. His choice had brought them to this. He and Chaitin were stripped to the waist. Their bodies told the story of 2 different generations of warriors. Chaitin was a thick slab of muscle and old scars, a monument to a lifetime of brutal warfare. Kai was leaner, his body a map of taut, ropey muscles built for speed and endurance rather than brute force. They were each handed a knife, not the long hunting knives they carried, but shorter, broader blades designed for one purpose: fighting in close quarters. The tribe formed a wide, silent circle around the 2 men. The space in the middle became a sacred, deadly stage. Annabelle was held fast at the edge of the circle, her face a pale mask of horror. She was forced to watch, a helpless spectator at the bloody drama she had set in motion. For a moment, the 2 combatants simply circled each other in the dust, the red twilight painting their skin the color of rust. The only sound was the soft scrape of their moccasins and the crackle of the fire. Chaitin made the first move. He charged with a guttural roar, a pure explosion of power, swinging his knife in a wide, vicious arc meant to disembowel Kai in a single stroke. Kai was not there. He moved like a dancer, sidestepping the clumsy rush, and as Chaitin lumbered past, the blade of Kai's knife flicked out, leaving a thin, red line across his opponent's ribs. First blood to Kai. A murmur went through the crowd. Chaitin bellowed in rage, more from the insult than the pain, and spun to face him. This time he was more cautious. He kept his knife in close, using his greater weight and reach to try and corner Kai, to trap him. The fight was a brutal contrast in styles. Chaitin was a bear, all crushing force and raw aggression. Kai was a cougar, relying on speed, agility, and precision. He darted in and out, landing shallow cuts on Chaitin's arms and shoulders, trying to wear the bigger man down. Chaitin, for his part, absorbed the blows, his focus on landing one single, devastating strike. He swung a backhand that Kai ducked, the air from the blow whistling past his ear. He lunged, and Kai was forced to give ground. Stumbling backward, the dust of the ring was kicked into a thick haze, and the air grew coppery with the smell of blood. Both men were slick with sweat, their breathing coming in harsh, ragged gasps. The initial fire in Chaitin's eyes had cooled into a look of murderous concentration. He feinted high with his knife and then kicked out, his foot catching Kai in the thigh, making him grunt in pain and falter. Seizing the opening, Chaitin surged forward, slamming his shoulder into Kai's chest. The impact drove the air from Kai's lungs and sent him staggering back. They fell into a desperate clinch, grappling for control, muscle straining against muscle. Chaitin's raw strength was overwhelming. He forced Kai's knife hand down, his other hand grabbing Kai by the throat, his thumb pressing into the windpipe. Kai's vision began to swim with black spots. He could hear Annabelle screaming his name, her voice a distant, desperate plea. He brought his knee up hard into Chaitin's groin. The older warrior roared in pain, his grip loosening for just a second. It was all the time Kai needed. He twisted, breaking the hold, and drove the pommel of his knife into Chaitin's temple. Chaitin staggered back, shaking his head to clear it, a trickle of blood running from his hairline. The fight had devolved from a duel of skill into a raw, ugly brawl. They were both wounded now, both bleeding from multiple cuts. The red light of the dying sun made it impossible to tell where sweat ended and blood began. "Is this what she has made you?" Chaitin snarled, spitting a wad of bloody saliva into the dust. A cornered rat, fighting with cheap tricks. "I fight for my life," Kai panted, circling again, his wounded leg aching. "Something you are trying to take from me." "I am trying to take the sickness from our people," Chaitin roared and charged again. This time, Kai was too slow. His injured leg buckled slightly as he tried to evade. Chaitin's charge was not a wild swing, but a calculated tackle. He crashed into Kai like a runaway boulder, and the two men went down in a heap. They rolled in the dirt, a desperate, writhing knot of violence. Chaitin's weight was a crushing advantage. He ended up on top, pinning Kai's arms with his knees. He raised his knife high, its blade a sliver of bloody light against the darkening sky. From his position on the ground, his body screaming in protest, his lungs burning, Kai looked past Chaitin's snarling, triumphant face. His gaze found the edge of the circle. He saw Annabelle, her face a perfect portrait of agony. Fighting against the warriors who held her, he was going to die. Here, in the dust of his own home, he was going to die. And she would be left alone. He had failed her. Everything seemed to slow down. Chaitin's arm began its descent. It was in that moment that Annabelle gave a final, desperate cry and broke free. Love and terror gave her a strength she didn't know she had. She ran across the circle, a flash of white in the bloody twilight, her only thought to get to him, to cover him, to stop the blade. She threw herself between the two men, directly into the path of the descending knife. Chaitin saw her at the last possible second. His eyes widened in shock. He tried to pull the blow, to twist his arm away, but the momentum was too great. The blade, meant to pierce Kai's heart, slashed across Annabelle's side. A single collective gasp rose from the entire tribe. Annabelle cried out, a sharp sound of pain and surprise. She looked down, her face paling. A dark, crimson flower bloomed with shocking speed across the simple fabric of her dress, spreading like a terrible stain. She staggered, her hands going to the wound, her eyes locking with Kai's. The sight of her blood, shed for him broke something deep inside Kai. A dam of rage, love, and despair that had been building for months finally burst. The warrior's discipline, the lifetime of stoic control, was utterly incinerated in the flames of his horror. He gave a roar that was not human. It was the sound of an animal seeing its mate struck down, with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength that defied his exhaustion. He heaved upward, throwing the stunned Chaitin off him. He didn't grab his knife. He didn't care about the duel. He scrambled to Annabelle, catching her as her knees gave way. He held her in his arms, pressing his hand against her bleeding side, feeling her warm blood soak his fingers. The entire world narrowed to her pale, pain-filled face. The duel, his people, his honor, it was all dust. Nothing mattered but her. He looked up from her wounded form, his eyes blazing with a fire that made even Chaitin take a step back. His gaze swept over the circle of his people, over the silent elders, over every face that had condemned her, that had forced this, and in the dead, profound silence of the twilight, under a sky as red as the blood on his hands, Kai screamed. He did not scream in English. He screamed in the tongue of his ancestors, in the language of his soul, so that every man, woman, and child would know the depth of his choice, the finality of his betrayal. Her life is my life, he bellowed, his voice cracking with agony and pure, undiluted love. He pulled her wounded body tighter against his, shielding her from their shocked stares. Do you hear me? I love her more than I love the people. Kai's cry echoed in the sudden, tomb-like silence of the valley. Asterisk, I love her more than I love the people, asterisk. The words were a blasphemy, a tearing of the sacred blanket of kinship that had defined his entire existence. He had not just broken a law, he had renounced a faith. He had declared a new, two-person tribe, and its only other member was bleeding out in his arms. The circle of his people was frozen, a gallery of shocked and uncomprehending statues. Even Chayton stood motionless, his knife hanging forgotten at his side, his face a mask of disbelief. He had won the duel in all but the final blow. Yet he had been utterly defeated. He had set out to prove Kai's loyalty was broken, and Kai had proven it more completely and devastatingly than Chayton could have ever imagined. The warrior had not just been corrupted, he had willingly, defiantly, chosen his corruption. Kai saw none of it. The world had shrunk to the woman in his arms. Annabelle's face was ashen in the dying light, her breathing shallow and ragged. The dark stain on her dress was spreading with alarming speed. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through his rage. He needed to stop the bleeding. He needed to get her away from here, away from the judgment, the hatred, the traditions that had just tried to kill them both. With a surge of desperate strength, he lifted her into his arms. She was a fragile weight, her head lolling against his shoulder with a terrifying lack of resistance. He turned his back on the council, on his past, on the entire world he had once called home, and began to walk. His path took him directly toward Hastian. The old elder's face was a ruin of sorrow. He had seen generations of warriors born and die, had presided over a century of change and loss. But he had never seen anything like this. He had never seen a heart so thoroughly conquered. As Kai passed, Hastian did not try to stop him. He only raised a trembling hand, a gesture that was half benediction, half farewell. Chayton finally shook himself from his stupor. A fresh wave of fury contorted his features. He is an exile asterisk and Doka asterisk, let them go. The desert will be their judge and their executioner, he bellowed to the warriors who had started to move. He wanted them gone. He wanted the stain of their existence removed from his sight. No one laid a hand on Kai as he walked through the camp. The people parted before him, their faces a mixture of awe, fear, and pity. He was a ghost now, a man who had died to them while still living. He walked to the small remuda of horses tied at the edge of the settlement. He chose 2 mounts, not with a warrior's eye for strength and stamina, but for steadiness. A sturdy gray mare for himself, and a gentle-looking pinto. He needed supplies. He laid Annabelle gently on a pile of blankets, whispering her name, trying to keep her tethered to the world. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with pain. Kai, she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. I am here, he said, his voice thick. I will not leave you. He worked with a frantic, single-minded purpose. He grabbed 2 water skins, filling them from a barrel. He found a leather pouch and stuffed it with dried jerky and hard, flat corn cakes, food he had helped to hunt and his mother had helped to prepare. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He took blankets, a coil of rope. He was a thief now, stealing from the people he had sworn his life to protect. As he was tying the supplies onto the horses, a figure emerged from the shadows of a nearby hogan. It was an old woman, his mother's sister. She did not speak. Her face was etched with a grief that transcended the politics of the council. In her hands, she held a small, buckskin pouch. She pushed it into Kai's hand, her fingers dry and cool against his skin. He opened it. Inside was a wad of yarrow leaves, a powerful agent to staunch bleeding, and a handful of willow bark for pain and fever. It was a medicine bundle, an act of forbidden mercy, an admission that even in the face of blasphemy, the ties of blood and love still whispered. He looked at her, his throat too tight to speak. She simply placed a hand on his cheek for a moment, a silent blessing, and then melted back into the shadows. He returned to Annabelle's side. The medicine was a small gift, but it was a gift of hope. He worked quickly, tearing a long strip from one of the blankets. He packed the yarrow leaves directly into the gash on her side, a desperate, rustic surgery under the first stars of the evening. She cried out, her body arching in a spasm of agony. "I am sorry," he grunted, the words torn from him. "I am sorry for all of it." He bound the makeshift bandage tightly around her torso, creating a thick pressure dressing. It was crude, but it would have to be enough. The bleeding seemed to slow. He gently lifted her onto the pinto, placing her sideways in the saddle like a child. He mounted the gray mare and took the pinto's reins. He looked back one last time at the camp. The figures around the fire were dark, unmoving silhouettes against the orange glow. It was a funeral pyre for the life he once had. He was an outcast, a man with no tribe, no name, no home. He was defined only by the wounded woman he led into the darkness. He turned the horses' heads to the west, toward the last, defiant smear of crimson on the horizon, and urged them into a steady walk. The days and nights that followed were a waking nightmare, a blur of pain and fear. They traveled through a landscape that was as desolate as their future. The land was their enemy now, and their only ally was the vast, empty space that separated them from their pursuers, both Navajo and white. Annabelle drifted in a feverish haze. The world was a series of torturous sensations, the constant, jarring motion of the horse, the fire in her side that never cooled, a thirst that no amount of water could quench. But through the pain, there were constants. The steady presence of Kai's horse beside hers, the feel of his strong, gentle hands as he lifted her down from the saddle, the sound of his voice, a low, constant murmur, speaking to her in his own language, not to be understood, but simply to soothe, to remind her she was not alone. Kai did not sleep. He could not afford to. During the day, he navigated, his eyes constantly scanning for water, for shelter, for any sign of pursuit. At night, he would make a small, hidden camp, and his true work would begin. He would tend to her, forcing sips of water between her cracked lips, changing her dressing, chewing the willow bark into a bitter paste to feed her. He would sit and watch her breathe in the darkness, his hand resting on her forehead, feeling the terrifying heat of her fever. He was a warrior, trained for battle, for hunting, for survival. He was not a healer. The helplessness he felt was a torment worse than any wound Chayton could have inflicted. He prayed to the spirits he had been raised to honor, knowing they had likely turned their faces from him. He had placed this woman above them, and now he was pleading with them to spare her. One evening, as the fever seemed to reach its peak, she began to murmur, her voice delirious. She spoke of her father's church, of green fields in Missouri, of her mother's hands kneading dough. She was walking back through the ruins of her life. Then, her eyes opened, clear for a moment, and they found his.
"You lost everything,"
she whispered, her voice a dry rustle.
"For me."
The guilt in her eyes was a knife in his heart. He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. "Before you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer contain. "I had my people, I had my honor, I had a place in the world." He gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her sweat-dampened forehead. "But I was alone. My heart was a stone. You broke the stone. I have lost the world. Annabelle, but I am not alone anymore." Tears welled in her eyes, tracking clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She reached up a weak, trembling hand and touched his face. "My love," she whispered, the words a final, complete surrender. And then her eyes closed, and she slipped back into the fever's grip. He stayed by her side all night, holding her hand, willing his own strength into her. He did not know if he was praying to her God or his spirits. only that he was begging the vast, silent darkness to let him keep this one precious light. Sometime before dawn, the fever broke. He felt the heat begin to recede from her skin, her breathing deepen and even out. He pressed his ear to her chest and heard the steady, blessedly regular beat of her heart. The relief that washed over him was so profound, so absolute, that it left him weak. He bowed his head over their joined hands, and, for the first time since he was a boy, he wept, silent, racking sobs of a man who had walked through the fires of hell and emerged on the other side. They rested for 2 more days in a hidden alcove until she had regained a sliver of her strength. The wound was beginning to heal, the edges knitting together. The road ahead was still impossibly long and dangerous. They were fugitives, outcasts with a price on their heads from 2 different worlds. They had no destination, no plan beyond the next sunrise. On the 3rd morning, he lifted her back onto the horse. She was weak, but she was alive. They rode out of the alcove and onto a high plain. The sun was rising behind them, and the vast, empty expanse of the west stretched out before them, a canvas of endless, terrifying possibility. He looked at her. A faint touch of color had returned to her cheeks. She met his gaze, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she gave him a small, weary smile. It was a sunrise all its own. They were exiles. They were hunted. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs, 2 tired horses, and a love that had cost them the world. But as they rode side by side into the vast, unknown heart of the continent, vanishing into the shimmering promise of the horizon, they were not tragic figures. They were free, free from the prejudices that had tried to tear them apart, free from the duties that had sought to bind them. Theirs was a love forged in blood and paid for in exile, a testament to the wild, indomitable truth that sometimes the only tribe that matters is a tribe of 2. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to read your thoughts, so please leave a comment below and let us all know where in the world you're tuning in from. If you enjoyed this journey into the heart of the Old West, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach even more listeners, please support us by hitting the hype button. It helps more than you know.